last lecture in this lecture series of urban political economy and sustainability, organized here at Tampere University by the Postcape project and the STUE profiling area of Tampere University. Please welcome Mika Hyötyläinen, who is a post-doctoral researcher at the Institute for Housing and Urban Research at Uppsala University, Sweden. And Mika's research interests include topics such as urban inequality, housing policy, land policy, and transformations in real estate policy in the Nordics. So hopefully you will find his lecture most interesting. Over to you, Mika. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and a privilege to be part of this lecture series. So that was a pretty thorough introduction already, but just to build up on a little bit on what was said of my background. So that's in social and public policy, and I defended my doctoral dissertation in 2019 at the University of Helsinki. And the topic was to look at certain institutional and legislative changes that had led to changes in land and housing policies in Finland on the state and municipal level, and to try and understand how those then relate to urban inequalities. So topics like segregation and residential differentiation between classes and ethnic groups are quite common topics within Nordic and European urban studies, but I felt there was a lack of kind of policy investigation related to those. And so since 2019 and defending my thesis, my perspective on these issues has shifted a little bit from kind of direct policy analysis to more trying to understand the theoretical and ideological underpinnings of land use and land policies. And well, as you see, the title has changed a little bit from what was in the course schedule, but what I hope to do today is try to build on this perspective that could lead a way towards a critical political economy of urban land in the Nordic cities. So the course description states that the purpose here is to explore how political economic relations shape and constrain policies aimed at promoting urban sustainability, and to problematize the methodological cityism of urban studies. So to move from kind of the study of cities as settlement types, as sites, towards more looking at urbanization as a process. And within this process, I think land is a pretty central key element, and it's worthwhile to have it as a topic of investigation. Whether we're talking about intensifying land use in urban centers, to bringing more people into the urban core, to like build more density, and or whether we're expanding and kind of broadening the urban landscape, which might then lead to habitat loss and encountering things like new diseases. So those are obviously also questions of sustainability, another theme of the course. But in addition to this, I think land is also a matter of social relations and customs and negotiations and negotiations over tenure and ownership of land. And within the urban context, I think these questions over the kind of embeddedness of land within social relations becomes increasingly important. And so this brings us to questions of management and allocation of land. And whether the market or the state perhaps is the best way to allocate land to its users. So before I give a kind of content slide of the lecture, I just want to start off with a small example that I hope maybe illustrates this idea of moving from a policy analysis to an exploration of the very theoretical underpinnings of land use in the Nordics. And I want to use Helsinki as an example to illustrate this. So in February of this year, the city of Helsinki renewed its principles of land policy. And there were basically two important principles to bear in mind that were reformed. Firstly, the city will now lease land for residential purposes, so it will no longer sell any of its land. And for all kinds of residential purposes except social housing, the leases will be set on the market. And so the city of Helsinki will lease the residential land according to bidding competitions and auctions. So a lot of these concepts that I've highlighted here, land policy, the leasing of land, market-based allocation, and competitive bidding will become clear, hopefully, over this lecture. And I hope that maybe you make a kind of note of this. The mayor of Helsinki, Ilona, then went on to say that leasing land provides us with an instrument that generates revenue, but it does not have harmful side effects for the urban economy. This is a widely agreed upon view among economists, the basic principles of which were first formulated by Henry George. So again, make a note of some of these points that I've highlighted here, and we'll try and ask some questions of these things. Land as a source of revenue, leasing land as not harmful to the urban economy, the views of economists, and the name Henry George. And some of the questions I hope to maybe answer during this talk is what other purposes might urban land have than to generate revenue for the municipality? Is it sustainable urban policy to try and maximize rent revenues from public lands? Can the generating of revenue from public land have other harmful side effects except for the economy? And what kind of other side effects might we want to think about? The social well-being of residents, the sustainability of cities. And are there other views that we might want to consider than those of economists? And finally, who the hell is Henry George? And why is Juhana Vartiainen so inspired by his approach? So as I said, what I hope to do is to provide a kind of overview of the history of what we might call the political economy of land. So I'm going to focus on the first two parts, building a political economy of land through the discussion of classical political economy, to Von Thunen's agricultural land use models, Marxist approaches to land and land rent, and the George's kind of pragmatist policies of land taxation. Secondly, to discuss urban economics, the marginalist turn into kind of neoclassical economics, and the Alonso Muth model of urban land use, and then critical urban political economy as a kind of countering of urban economics, especially in the work of David Harvey, and then the role of the state within all of this. And here I'll bring in the Finnish author of Land Rent, Anne Haila's work on Singapore as a city-state. So, and then finally, if I haven't run out of steam, I'll then bring in this kind of example of Helsinki and how we might try to question some of the mainstream narratives of the practicality and efficiency of the land use that is now being kind of marketed as the justification for those changes in land policy that I just explained, and also to look at some of the previous changes that have happened over the past 20 years within Helsinki's land policy into what, in the article that I shared with you guys, we've called an entrepreneurial real estate policy. So this is the first time that I do this. As I said, my background is in policy research, but now within the past 2 to 3 years, I've changed my focus a bit more into kind of political economic perspectives, and I apologize for using you as guinea pigs to try and test out this lecture, but I hope it's illustrative and interesting. So let's get to it. So for the part one on the political economy of land here, I basically draw on 3 sources here, but mention others as well. In a selfish act of advertisement, there's a book out that I've edited with Robert Beauregard called The Political Economy of Land. It should be out by the end of this month. So what I'll be talking about next is kind of these classical political economists and the role of land within these debates. I'm also drawing on Anne Haila's book, Urban Land Rent, Singapore as a Property State, and then my colleague Callum Ward and his colleague Manuel Almerce's great article on the shitty rent business, what's the point of land rent theory. So if by the end of this lecture you're more interested in rent theory, I highly suggest going to this article at least. It's a very kind of illuminating overview of the development of the theory of rent. I guess, so before we start talking about the political economy of land, it's useful to also distinguish what do I mean by when we talk about land here. So for me, and the way in my work I approach it, first of all, it's literally a matter of existence. It's like the real materiality of human activity. It's indispensable for all of us. We all need it simply to be. And so it's obviously also a natural resource that we all depend on. And this dependency forces us in a way to organize the use and allocation of land in ways that allows for our continued reproduction as a species and as societies. So land it's very important. But because of these issues of use and allocation, it's also fruitful to think of it as something more than a natural resource or a scarce resource. We should also think of it, as I said in the very beginning, as embedded in social relations. And for kind of millennia, people have built social relations around land through different forms of collective use and common stewardship of the land. So there are different forms of community-based property systems, often based in kind of indigenous tenure regimes that acknowledge the notion that we all need land, and they build on traditional norms and customs to govern the allocation and the use and the transfer of land. So these so-called customary systems are kind of based on the shared interest of the community within the land. So I'm not an expert on the issue, but there has been the point made, and I think it's a kind of useful question to make about the kind of Sami question that is very topical now in Finland. How much of that debate is actually rooted within the question of land and the kind of neo-colonial extractive methods of taking that land into other uses than these kind of customary uses. But anyway, the idea that land has been used as a commons throughout the world means that it has been kind of an open access resource to be used for things like grazing and shifting cultivation, gathering from the woods, and no one has had individual possession over it. So land has been a commons. But then something happens in Western thought 300 years ago or so that leads to land becoming treated as private property, and wealthy individuals being able to enclose the land and exclude others from using it. And land becomes treated as a commodity after that. Polanyi talks about it as a fictitious commodity. Strangely enough, being a commodity, even though it is not a product of human labor. And so land then becomes exchanged for a price, made a profit on, and allocated to its use in the market. Coming into even closer kind of the contemporary period, land and buildings become objects of investment. And in the kind of late capitalist period, they become financial assets traded speculatively in global financial markets, as Özlem Çelik probably talked about in her lecture regarding, as I understand, financialization of housing, which are basically improvements on land. So part of the political economy of land, I find, is to explain what happened, and I'll try and give a cursory overview of this. And so one place to begin to try and explain what happened is obviously John Locke's second treatise on government. So he was an English philosopher of the Enlightenment period, widely considered the founding father of liberal thought. Rejecting the divine rights of kings, he argued that there are certain kind of natural, inalienable rights that belong to every individual, namely their lives, their liberties, and their estates, which is the land that they own. The question that bothered him is, how does one then become into possession of land? So the Bible had obviously stated that God gave land to all of us in common, so how could one take something into possession that was the common? So Locke then came to argue that this happens when one mixes their labor with the land, and this became known as the labor theory of property. So basically, when I put my labor into the land and start to make use of it, that land becomes mine. And so we have this development of kind of private property ideals and a possessive individualism. And another important argument that he makes, which is kind of at the back of a lot of liberal thought, is that the role of government is to protect these natural rights. And obviously, even today, a major role of the state is to help to protect private property rights. but it shouldn't meddle within these lives and liberties of estates of individuals. And so Locke's ideas then spark a kind of European liberal thinking that became increasingly prevalent in the 18th century. And when it comes to the field of economics, particularly discussing the role of land within the history of economic thought, one will usually at this point then meet the physiocrats. So these were a group of French thinkers who developed kind of the foundations of laissez-faire economic philosophy, arguing that markets function best when free of government constraints and meddling. And they were, as I said, one of the first to kind of contemplate the role that land played in the economy. And for physiocrats, land was the source of value. And this is kind of important when we start to developing these notions of political economy of land. And so perhaps the best known is François Quesnay, who developed this economic table in 1758. And this has been considered one of the kind of first attempts to build some kind of analytical depiction of the functioning of the economy. And so these guys argued that land, as I said, was the only source of value, and agricultural labor, which is the first group of kind of three classes that they found in the society, are the only productive class. So what the agricultural laborers, the farmers, what they do is they bring the fruits of the land into our use. The second group is a class of artisans who then work on those products, on those resources, turn them into commodities, and so on. And finally, you have a class of kind of gentry and landlords, the proprietor class, who extracts a portion of revenues as rent to be then invested back into this cycle. So these were thought of as kind of natural laws of the economy compared to the kind of cardiovascular system of the human body, bringing nutrients to the body, bringing kind of resources into the economy. And when when the circulation within this system was in balance, there would be a kind of balance between these three classes. So this is it's a first instance of thinking around the place of land in the economy, establishing that land is the source of value. Then maybe a name that we are more familiar with, Adam Smith, later in the 18th and 19th centuries, the relationship between kind of people and production and land was being rethought, and so Adam Smith and David Ricardo come to the stage. And in Wealth of Nations, which is a kind of foundational work for economics, Adam Smith proposes that the value of products should be understood instead in relation to the amount of labor that goes into their production. So it's not land that is the source of value. It's labor in manufacturing. And so he proposes the labor theory of value, which is a kind of classical political economy established idea, which states that the economic value of a commodity depends on how much labor must be spent in order to produce it. And so for Smith, land is merely one necessary factor of production next to capital and labor. And rent on the land is paid simply for the right to use the land. So there's three kinds of income within capitalism within Adam Smith thought: wages for labor working in enterprises, profits for capitalists who own the means of production, and then rents paid to the owners of land. And so rent becomes merely a basic element of the economy in a way that it's a payment made for a scarce resource that should exchange in a free market. So David Ricardo is then better known for developing the theory of rent on the basis of Smith's proposals and his proposal of the labor theory of value. So Ricardo comes to ask in his book on the principles of political economy and taxation, if labor is the only source of value and land requires no labor to produce it, so it cannot have a value, how does it command this rent? How does it command a price? And so he introduces the notions of fertility, marginal land, and differential rent. And so for Ricardo, rent is based on the fertility of land. And not all land for agriculture, which was the kind of land that we talked about at the time, obviously, not all of that land is of same quality. So he reasoned that the rent on any kind of good quality arable land would always be relative to what he called the marginal land. That's arable land that is so poor that it doesn't command a rent, but it's fertile enough to be in use. Okay, that's also known as the margin of production. And within this kind of organization, the landlord comes to take the resulting extra yield as a condition of the farmer's access to the land. So rent for Ricardo was differential rent based on the differences within the fertility of the land. And one of his preoccupations was about the distribution of value in society. So how does this come about that there's this propertied class of rentiers and the gentry who kind of extract a part of the product and value made in production? And there are still today many kind of political economists thinking around the Ricardian kind of notions. Maybe one of the more popular ones, Mariano Mazzucato, who writes a lot on kind of the growing inequality of income and wealth as a question of redistribution. So then developing kind of these theoretical notions within political economy into more geographical land use models is the 19th century German landowner and farmer Johann Heinrich von Thunen, who creates perhaps the first known spatial economic model on land rent, using observations that he had kind of made. And this is quite important to understand, for also to be able to unpack a lot of the notions of contemporary mainstream urban economists and their thinking around of kind of the spatial differences of cities. So before we go to that, so Ricardo's rent theory concerned agricultural land. This von Thunen then asks, well, you have all these kind of competing different uses of land. So how do they fit into this rent theory? And so he modifies the Ricardian assumptions regarding rent differentials. And so these were dependent not so much on the increased productivity over the worst land, but they become a function of the distance from the market or the urban center. So you have different forms of production that become placed along this kind of concentric circle based on kind of the transportation costs and the location from the market. So the land that is closest to the market has the lowest transportation costs, but it then comes to command the highest bid rent. So it'll be more expensive to produce on that land that is closer to the market, but what you're gaining is the kind of lack in transportation costs. So there becomes this competitive bidding over the land based on the location among farmers and agricultural producers, right? And they find their places along these kind of spheres of production around or these concentric rings that today are known as the von Thunen rings. So then, to kind of criticize a lot of what has been said so far, obviously Karl Marx steps to the scene and comes to challenge many of the assumptions of classical political economy, building a critique of the capitalist mode of production and its related exploitative social relations. In obviously work on the critique of political economy. So a massive work, and obviously I haven't read all volumes of it, and I've read a bits of it in volume 3 on rent theory and so on. So not that I would be even able to talk a lot about it, but I'll pick on a few of the elementary things that he kind of had to say about land as it deals with political economy. And we'll get to urban political economy. It's a long story. I think we need to understand this. So for Marx, land was integral to the very kind of birth and advance of capitalism. He went back to ask questions about the very origin of private property that I began with, the notion of the commons and collective uses and customary ownership modes. And so how did it come to be that all of this land became private property? And so for Marx, capitalism is underpinned by the violent dispossession of workers from the means of production, which entailed the enclosure of common lands. So within the feudal organized kind of society, you would have people sharing parcel or landed areas, whether for agriculture or gathering resources from the woods or so on, used as a commons. But they became enclosed, fenced out, and privatized, and so they were dispossessed of their very land. And in this historical event that Marx calls a primitive accumulation, it's the very original, also known as original accumulation. It's the very first instance of kind of accumulating something that was common. Peasants were dispossessed of their land. They were proletarianized and then driven to cities to sell to capitalists the only thing that they have left, which is their labor power. So then by exploiting the working class, making people work more than was necessary to restore that labor power, a surplus value is being created in society. And this is kind of the basic notion of capitalist accumulation. So the owner of the means of production, the capitalist, could now collect as a profit that surplus value and accumulate their wealth and invest in future production. And so rent for Marx is simply one way of extracting the surplus that is rooted in the exploitation of labor. So it's a social relation of power and of control and domination, not merely some kind of competitive price and a payment for a scarce resource, as a political economist before him had stated. So for Marx, it's important to understand that these private property regimes end up in monopolies. So land is owned by a class of landowners who come to be in a position of monopoly. And the basis of rent is this very kind of social organization and these kinds of relations. There's a monopolization of portions of the globe by a certain class who comes to demand a payment for its use. And so under capitalism and this private property regime, this class receives rent from those who wish to use the land. And for Marx, all surplus value originally comes from the exploitation of the labor. So whether it's rent going to landlords or interest paid to financial institutes or money lenders or profit for the industrial capitalist, beneath all of that is labor exploitation. Beneath is always the kind of uneven relations between labor and capital. And so he writes that the entire surplus value passes straight from the hands of the worker to those of the capitalists. The capitalist confronts the worker as the direct owner of the entire surplus value in whatever manner he may later be sharing it with the financer or the landowner or so on. Right? So now we have an understanding of rent as a social relation of domination and exploitation and power and hierarchy, instead of a simple kind of market mechanism over different types of fertility of land or so on. And so I mentioned in the beginning, or I cited Juhana Vartiainen and his infatuation with the new principles of land policy in Helsinki. And in his speech to the city council, he celebrated this guy, Henry George. And so Henry George was a kind of influential and pragmatic journalist and land reformer who, kind of building on a lot of what has been said so far, he said that rent is unearned. It's an unearned increment extracted by the landowner. And for George, it is this extraction of the land rent that is actually the source of poverty and inequality in the society. And he advocated for a reform program that would target the landlords and not so much the capitalists. So Marx would have advocated nationalizing land and taking back the means of production through a proletarian revolution. But George didn't go quite that far. He was fine with leaving in place the capitalist relations of exploitation, but he said we should tax the land rent. We should confiscate back to the society and then redistribute it. So he suggested that we do away with private property, we make land ownership public, but then leave land in individual possession, and individual users of land continue to compete within the market for the use of the land, bid rent for it, but then the rent that is paid to them is taxed back to the society. And this is kind of interesting that it is being brought up in contemporary Finnish land policies. And the justification here is that land values are a social product. And this has been kind of, I mean, there is a logic to it that it has been turned into the kind of urban era, that we can understand cities as these collective kind of conglomerations and products of all of our work together and just being together and creating together, and we are the ones who create the value of the city, so it kind of makes sense that landowners who will try and extract that value are then taxed based on it. And even Marx and Friedrich Engels then saw some good in this Henry George's ideas, and in the Communist Manifesto there are these things called transitional policies, and one of them is the abolition of property in land and application of all rents on land to public purposes. Later, Marx came to criticize George's ideas for being rather bourgeois and liberal. But anyway, maybe we get back to George. But now, coming from this kind of meandering story of classical political economy to more contemporary urban economics and urban political economy. So in a way, Locke's ideas of private property still do prevail in many parts of the world. Property rights proponents hold that land should be assigned with private property rights, commodified, and allocated to its uses in the land market, where supply and demand set the correct prices for it. And some of the justifications for these are, and perhaps you've talked about some of these issues along the course, is that there are powerful institutions who think that by assigning private property rights on land, we can deter so-called free rider problems. Or as Gareth Hardin talked about them in 1968 as tragedy of the commons, that if you leave land as a commons, people will come to exploit it for their own personal means and uses, and that will never actually work, and we need to privatize land. So with the lead of contemporary neoclassical economists, perhaps one of the most well-known around thinking on the privatization of land being Hernando de Soto, the thinking prevails that poor people in the developing world are kind of trapped in poverty due to the fact that their property rights are they are undefined. And so they're kind of unable to unlock the potential in the land as they don't have the private property rights to it. And that we should do away with these kind of customary and commons organizations. Global finance institutions like the World Bank have pushed for land privatization and implementation of property rights throughout the global south. But if we now come to this kind of turn in the idea of where value also comes from. So for Smith and Ricardo, as we said, it was a measure of the labor invested in the land, and kind of towards the end of the 1800s, there's this idea of the marginalist revolution. We turn from classical to modern and neoclassical economics. And something the marginalist thinkers, so these are like William Jevons in England and Karl Menger in Austria, and then the Swiss Leon Walras, they start to think that the value of commodities is not determined at the point of production, but it's determined at the point of consumption. And this is a major turn in economic thinking around the notion of value. And the concept of utility becomes here important. So the value of a commodity is based on the utility that it gives to the consumer. Utility being kind of how much satisfaction can I gain or benefit from consuming a product or perhaps even a service. And the concept of marginal utility comes to mean how much an individual gets from one more unit or a good or a service. It's this notion of in Finnish, Raja Hyöty. But anyway, There's this idea that value is also subjective, and we have preferences over commodities, and it's not so much through the production process, but our individual subjective preferences over distinct commodities. So preferring wine over beer, and so on. So those kind of things start to matter a lot more in the kind of economic organization. And finding equilibrium and balances in supply and demand is more about kind of consumption and demand for products. And so now with this kind of turn in the ideas around value, urban economics is developed. And it's broadly understood as the kind of economic study of urban areas and urban land use. And it's important to understand, I think, the theoretical underpinnings and the kind of ideological roots of urban economics, because it dictates a lot of the policies and influences or inspires a lot of the policies that we even in kind of Nordic welfare states implement regarding land use. So maybe like the best known of urban economists is William Alonso, this Argentinian-born American planner and economist who in a book called Location and Land Use defines a model to the formation of land rent in urban environments. And you might remember these von Thunens, concentric rings. So what Alonso does is basically translate the von Thunen rings to the urban context. The agrarian land use model to the urban land use, and based on the neoclassical framework of marginal utility and of equilibrium prices. So, like von Thunen, Alonso assumes a kind of central market, but in the city it's called the central business district. And he assumes increasing transportation costs as you go further away from the central business district. So urban land use then comes to be determined through a process of competitive bidding for the use of land. And at this time you start to see within the kind of large American metropolis a concentration of poor, marginalized peoples within inner cities, whereas the bid rent theory and kind of location theories show that the land in the center is the most expensive, and transportation costs are higher in the kind of peripheral areas. And so the idea is here that people living in poverty, they don't really have money to spend for transportation costs, so they're forced to live in kind of expensive land but small apartments, and to live in areas that they actually have the least money to spend for. So so the rich can then choose to live further out and pay more towards transport costs and to own a larger plot of land in the urban periphery. So this is kind of the idea of the American city, where you have this kind of detached home owner occupation in the periphery of the city and a kind of dilapidating but expensive inner city. In Finland, some of the urban and kind of land use economists are Heikki Loikkanen and Seppo Laakso, who notably up to today use a lot this kind of bid rent curves and ideas of the Alonso model, and it really has become a kind of general theory of urban land use in economics and kind of taken for granted within mainstream thinking on how land is allocated and exchanged in the market. So then thinking about this, this kind of notion of urban inequality and concentration of poverty and marginality, and sticking with the American city and the American metropolis, there's a kind of revolutionary text that comes to spark in the 1970s, a critical urban political economy that affects urban geography and sociology approaches in a very profound way. And this is David Harvey's book, Social Justice and the City. So what he does here is puts forth a critique of the Alonso model of the bid rent curve and the kind of land use model that they had established on the basis of von Thunen's ideas. So with this book, Urban Political Economy emerges as a critique of the urban economics paradigm. And what Harvey does is draw on Marxist theory and introduces class and power relations to the discussion on urbanization. And he moves away from these kind of concentric land use models and creates a more kind of comprehensive understanding of the central role of land in urban politics. And really what he does is, what he does for Marx, what Alonso and Muth did for Ricardo and von Thunen. And he translates the Marxist approach to land and rent from the agricultural context to the urban. And one of the really interesting notions in the book when thinking about, for me at least, when thinking about urban inequality and these topics of segregation and residential differentiation, is to think of the kind of critical and dialectical reasoning of Harvey around what he calls the notion of ghetto formation. So as I said, he worked in the context of the American metropolis, where Black Americans were predominantly living in inner city dilapidated areas. And at the time, this was starting to be seen as a problem, and still is today. I mean, immense amounts of reports and research written on the topic of segregation. And a lot of the objective in these kind of reports was to do away with the ghetto formation. So how do we do away with this unwanted segregation of neighborhoods? Well, if the von Thunen and Alonso and Muth theories explain that it's a kind of product of the competitive bidding for the land, as was just explained, then Harvey goes on to say, well, don't we then have to change the very reality that gives truth to these theories? That we shouldn't just simply pinpoint and describe with these urban economics land use models what's going on, but we should eliminate the mechanism that generates the theory, that gives truth to the theory. And so we should eliminate competitive bidding for land. And so it's kind of a very kind of logical turn of thinking, and it's the private property in land that allows real estate owners and developers to extract surplus value in the form of rent and to force households to enter into these bidding competitions for residential space. And it is this kind of organization that gives the truth to the theory under a lot of urban economics. And so the question, of course, then becomes, so what do we do about that? What alternatives do we have to these kind of land regimes that are predicated on bidding competitions and private ownership of land and real estate? Now, one person to think a lot throughout her career on the notion of alternatives was the Finnish Anne Haila, a professor of urban studies at the University of Helsinki, passed away in 2019. And one alternative that she proposes was in her book of 2016, Urban Land Rent Singapore as a Property State. And there's three key takeaways in this book on kind of alternatives to these private property regimes, which are rather interesting. Think what you will of Singapore. So the government there owns 90% of land, and it only leases land. Remember what Helsinki is now doing. So land is treated as a public good in Singapore, and the kind of prevailing wisdom that private ownership and property is necessary for economic growth becomes criticized through Singapore in her work, because obviously it's a very kind of wealthy and functioning capitalist economy. So Singapore proves that public ownership of land kind of allows for land use planning to be implemented much more easily than in cities where it's private property. So the city can, through this ownership, decide what gets built and where. Another key point is about housing policy. So after 140 years of British colonization, when Singapore became independent in 1965, the government set out to implement the public housing policy in order to answer the housing shortage. And so it's quite fascinating then that more than 80% of Singaporeans today live in owner-occupied public housing. And this is due to robust and strict state housing policies. Home ownership has there been seen as a kind of key also to nation building, and it makes up the core of the housing policy, with different kind of home ownership schemes where there is state funding given through the Housing Development Board. And so because all residents are allocated public housing, the role of competitive bidding for residential space is not as prominent in shaping the socio-spatial formation of the city. Right? You don't have this notion of ghetto formation troubling Singapore. And then a third key takeaway is the land reform that was implemented after Singapore gained its independence, and again inspired by Henry George. So land was acquired by the state, and then it's leased out for different purposes. And for the governments in Singapore, extensive land ownership is a resource that gives them power and highlight rights not only to subsidize some types of land use, like housing and industry, but also to capture the increased value of undeveloped land and prevent speculation. And she calls this then a property state, where real estate plays an important role in the economy and public revenue and the wealth of the people. Not very far-fetched from what Juhana Vartiainen was saying at the council meeting, that leasing land is a source of revenue, that it's good for the economy and for the kind of wealth of the people. So turning soon to kind of talk about the Finnish case and the case of Helsinki, I think it's good to bear in mind this kind of caveat that Hyla makes in the book on the role of the state as a landowner. So she says that the public ownership of land is merely a condition. It's not decisive in the way that it would immediately allow for these kinds of policies to be implemented. So governments can easily use their landed assets for the public good, or they can use it for allocating it to the highest bidder. It's a question of politics and policy. And I think this notion forces us to explore the role of the state and the municipality as landowners, and also the policies that steer their approaches to land management. This is what I'll try and do in the kind of third remainder of this lecture is to talk about how this kind of political economy can be, the critical urban political economy can be used to analyze what's going on in the land use decisions within Helsinki. And I'll talk a bit about the studies that I did for my PhD, and then I'll try and end up with this more recent changes as a continuation of a trend towards a kind of more entrepreneurial and business savvy role of the public as of the municipality as a landowner. But again, it's good to start with the definition. So when we're talking about land policy, what is it? So I used the definition given by land use scholar Pekka Virtanen. There's a great book for those who read Finnish on kunnan maapolitiikka, which talks a lot about the practicalities and also the kind of ideological framings of land policy in Finland. But he defines land policy as the means and goals of a public authority to deal with the acquiring, allocating and using of land, but also the pricing of areas and the development of property rights and tenures. So land policy is something that allows us kind of to answer questions of planning, housing development, of economic development, corporate needs for land and the availability of services. And in Finland, the responsibilities of public authorities pertaining to land policy are stipulated in the Land Use and Building Act, maankäyttö- ja rakennuslaki. What else? Well, some more kind of background data. So in Finland, roughly 60% of the land is private property. State owns about 30%, and municipalities, along with some corporations and religious congregations, own about 10%. So out of this municipal land ownership, Finnish cities are owners of a significant amount of urban land. And this kind of goes back to the Swedish rule when the Crown donated land for urban development. So the city of Helsinki, for instance, has had a kind of generous amount of donated land from the Crown to be used for its urban development. And this has kind of established a history of public land ownership in Finland, where municipalities use their land banks for the public good, and they don't allocate it into private purposes, or they don't privatize land. And so this has enabled the ability of municipalities to intervene in community development, free from private influence. And along with this kind of policy goes what's known as the planning monopoly, which has given local governments great power of urban development. So in Finland, but this also goes to Sweden, the municipality has the legal right to decide the content, the timing, and restrictions included in plans. And this is what's known as the planning monopoly. So again, it means that the municipalities have the sole right to assign development rights. You don't have private landowners going around saying what gets built where. It's the task of the municipality. And the basic justification for public planning monopoly is that no private interest should be allowed to overrule the public interest in the development of the built environment in Finnish cities. As an example, in the post-war era, municipal land policy in the Nordic welfare state enabled the kind of housing production systems that were organized and developed to answer the post-war housing shortages. So in Sweden, the Million program, and in Finnish cities, the building of housing estates. So the public holding of developable land enabled the kind of restraining of land rent extraction by private property owners, and it aimed at distributing affordable quality housing throughout the city. We can also talk about this kind of public approaches to land policy and land use, I guess in the notion of social sustainability. And this idea of leasing has brought a predictable long-term revenue for cities, allowing them to purchase raw land for the future needs. And this has been called active land policy. So the revenue from the land and leasing it is used simply to get more land for municipal needs, for the future kind of projections. And the focus has been on land use and not the market or exchange value of the public land. So there's been a kind of public control over development, and there's the kind of Finnish cities are well known in at least international comparisons for having kind of low levels of segregation and these kinds of urban inequalities, and much of it has to do with this, with the way we allocate and approach land policy. So. In my doctoral thesis, which hopefully will be published next year as a book, but we'll see how it goes. But anyway, in that work, I make the argument that since the turn of the millennium, there were certain kind of changes within a lot of the land policy that I just, and the kind of social sustainability mechanisms of land policy that I just explained. First of all, cities established so-called premises centers through these kind of strategic departments to use and manage public real estate. So public services became rent-paying tenants of these premises centers, and what the city started to do is to calculate alternative costs. So thinking about We were just talking about this very building, actually. That's what's been done here. Is they're selling this building, or?
Yes, the building is being sold as well as the ground on which it is.
Yeah. So this is a general tendency of public actors to start thinking about alternative costs. So what other use could possibly bring better revenue from the use of that space? And this is a very new kind of idea of public administration in Finland, where, as I said, the tradition has been to promote the use values, the lecture halls and spaces for students and teaching. But now we start thinking about in competitive terms and in exchange value terms, what other alternatives are there for that? And maybe we could make a better profit out of it in another use. So there was an article that maybe some of you read on also an experiment with the selling of the central residential land in Helsinki for this kind of exclusive housing project. So that was the first of kind of these kinds of experiments. There haven't been too many. And then there's been the increasing use of contracts and competitions in land use, which in a way jeopardize the planning monopoly of the city, in that it brings a lot more power to private actors to negotiate over development rights and what gets built where. So let's just look at this in a bit more detail, since I guess I have still time. So I think the first sign of the approach to public land was changing was, as I said, the establishment of these premises centers as special purpose public agencies. So previously, municipal land policy and real estate management were the responsibilities of public offices that allocated spaces for the needs of public services. So now public service providers like schools and healthcare centers and libraries became rent-paying tenants of these special purpose agencies. And since the early 2000s, they've been tasked also with the selling and leasing of premises and real property for both the public and private sectors. So one example, again, that I like to think of is from my kind of childhood neighborhood of Rajala in Helsinki, where there was a very nice, I think 50s built library building. Nice Nordic, I don't know, maybe functionalist, whatever architecture style anyway. Very, near and dear to the residents of that neighborhood. Now, what the city now has done is it moved the library into a shopping mall to be a tenant of a of a Norwegian real estate investment company, because it counted that by selling the land it can make better revenues, and it's now selling the premise of the library, and the library itself is a tenant of a private operator. So this is the idea of creating surplus in kind of public assets, and then selling off those surpluses to private corporations that are viewed as more efficient and business savvy users of land. There's another great book out, Land Fictions: The Commodification of Land and Land in City and Country. There's a article by Brett Christophers and Heather Whiteside on exactly this point of creating surplus from public assets, and their case studies are from Canada and the UK, but very similar processes, and it's not like the city of Helsinki made up these things. They're learning these practices from elsewhere, and a lot of it comes from the Anglo-American context. So as I said, this calculating of alternative costs, the idea is to make the users of premises more aware of the expenses also. So the real estate expenses of public services should be compared to what are the expenses in the private sector. And I think this is important because it in a way it allows for the logic of competitive bidding to enter into the thinking of public institution, of public land management and land policy. And one of the arguments that is constantly being given and is kind of an irksome feature of the narratives in the mainstream around this is, and a lot of journalists tend to use this, but also local politicians, is that by getting rid of this surplus, by selling public land, we're returning money to the taxpayer. I think, if we all had €1 every time we read this notion somewhere, we'd see more money than what's been returned from selling public real estate. Anyway, so the kind of idea behind this is that if the rent on the land is not maximized, it's some kind of unwanted subsidy. And this has come to now be reflected also on kind of the housing issue in Helsinki. When it starts to lease land for residential purposes on the market. So there's this idea that if we don't take the market rent out of the land, then we're subsidizing people who possibly could be able to pay the market price for their housing. And I think this is a kind of strange logic that affordable housing should only be meant for the market incapable, what the housing policy is called the special groups. Why couldn't land be a public asset that's used for the public good, being affordable housing for the majority of us? So there's this alternative cost thinking that it's steering the policy development now. Well, another example of this kind of contractual and partnership model being used more and more is the case of Pasila. But basically the legislation regarding land use in Finland has traditionally been based on the principle that, so as I said, cities have the sole right to decide when and where urban planning and development takes place. But there was a reform concerning land use in the Land Use and Building Act of 2000, which legalized the land use contracts and development areas. And these are now kind of public-private partnerships, again, where private actors come to have more say through kind of agreements and negotiations with the municipalities. And these allow municipalities to pass some of the responsibilities over planning and development to developers. And with the land use contracts, the developers can be obligated to build public utilities, and the city can roll over some of the expenses for development to the private sector. But however, the development areas are also used to enable the kind of very fast development of new neighborhoods. And so these conflicts then arise in large development areas, and one case was this Pasila kind of high-rise building project where UIT, I think, was the developer who then eventually, because it didn't get the massive amount of development rights, even though the deal was already made, it just withdrew from the project, and now the plot sits empty. So these kinds of are rather new features of the land use negotiations, where private actors can have these kinds of say over like putting the brakes on development. Maybe I'll finish with this slide, which is not what I hope to do in the future, is to develop on my research in Finland. And curiously, since starting this position as researcher at Uppsala, I've been reading across like Nordic research on land use issues, and I find that at least in Copenhagen and in Stockholm, very similar trajectories are underway. So they all have these kind of strategic real estate management companies that now manage urban land and real estate in kind of entrepreneurial ways. They all allocate public land to its users through auctions, so competitive bidding has become more and more important in all of these cities. There's the idea of maximizing land values, and then the kind of Georgist-inspired idea of feeding that money back into urban development. and they're all building massive inner city kind of brownfield development sites on old industrial areas where, you know, high-rise buildings and shopping malls and so on, and using public revenue as a kind of this cycle of investment into the built environment. And I think, you know, for the future, that's where I see my trajectory building more on not looking at the kind of policy specificities of this, but actually looking at, you know, a lot of what I've talked about today, kind of the theoretical and ideological moorings and underpinnings of these kinds of processes and how they've come to be so ingrained within the urban political economy of the Nordic city. So thanks for listening. I'll finish there.